got a little bit left to cover on money to wrap up the very last thing we talked about last time, and then I plan on doing some review for the test. So that's my game plan. So we're going to start off where we left off with what we call the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money. And what this is the theory that came about from Milton Friedman's work, and it asserts that in the long run, real GDP is at its potential, and velocity is constant. Asserts that in the long run, real GDP is at its potential and velocity is constant. Therefore, increases in the money supply lead to equal increases in the price level. More shortly, or more succinctly put, a percentage change in the money supply equals the percentage change in the price level. Monetary policy is ultimately inflationary. Now I know some of you guys are struggling to figure out, well, what's inflation again? And we got to work through those bugs. That was some of the chapter 4, chapter 5 stuff, but this is kind of a big statement. What we said before is that, well, we don't really care about inflation. If the prices of stuff at Walmart goes up by 10%, do I care? Well, yeah, I care if my income stays constant. But if my income goes up by 10% and the prices on the shelves at Walmart go up by 10%, I can buy the same amount of stuff I used to be able to buy, right? So if resource prices and output prices move up together, I don't really care about inflation. So that's significant because there's a lot of brain power, especially in today's economy, that's been put into monetary policy. Milton Friedman's claim is that in the long run, so that's what I mean by ultimately here, is inflationary. Monetary policy is ultimately inflationary. So his prescription was to not really do monetary policy. So since it don't matter, why do it? Since it don't matter in the long run, I better keep adding that little caveat, meaning that there are some short-run effects that might kick in. Since it don't matter in the long run, why do it? Maybe we should just have a policy of, for example, set the percentage change in money supply equal to 3%. So in other words, the policy by the government would be, this year we're going to increase money supply by 3%. That's our policy. Next year, it's going to be 3%. The following year after that, it's going to be 3%. 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%. If Milton Friedman's concept is right, what do you, as principles of macroeconomics students, predict that interest or that inflation will be if the Federal Reserve does this as a policy? 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%. What do you predict inflation will be? 3%. See how simple that makes it? So that's kind of the gist of what Milton Friedman was getting at, is that the government injects more issues into the economy, more uncertainty, less transparency, by continuing to tinker here, tinker there, increase the money supply, decrease it. Well, maybe we should do this program, maybe we should buy long-term bonds, maybe we should buy short-term bonds. And it ends up just being kind of a big cloud that makes it harder for us to make decisions. Because as we've learned so far, there's a lot of things that are linked to inflation for you to make efficient decisions. For you to know if the pay increase that you got from your boss of 5% is good or bad, right? So inflation matters, we know that. But you can see how much more clarity we potentially bring to society by having one less thing out there to try to predict with uncertainty. So if this is it, then long run inflation will equal 3%. Less uncertainty. Less uncertainty with decisions. Okay, so last time where all of this came from, I put on the board. So the next component of this that you need to know for the test is the equation of exchange. The equation of exchange is kind of tied into this quantity theory of money. That was the one that said, you know, if we look at nominal GDP, which we're kind of expressing a little bit strange here, but this is real GDP. This is the price level, the average price of things. Price times quantity gives us nominal GDP in a given year. The dollar value of stuff that's being exchanged. The top part of our market, in the goods market, C plus I plus G plus X, the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the nation's boundaries over the course of a year, that stuff is bought with money. There's a quantity of money that is used to buy that stuff. Those dollars get spent many times in a given year. We can look at the average number of times that a dollar gets spent, we call velocity. So this is the equation of exchange that then helps us start to see what Milton Friedman was thinking about with this quantity theory of money. All right. The last little augmentation I want to do to this is to take the equation of exchange and think about it in terms of percentage changes, which might help tie together this inflation business and other things. So if I'm not going to derive any super sophisticated mathematical stuff here, but if we think about these in percentage changes, the multiplication ends up being an addition problem. So you can just take my word on that or look in the textbook. But we can think about the percentage change in the price level plus the percentage change in real GDP Both of those things you saw from chapter 4 and 5, right? Real economic growth, the amount of stuff that we have going on, the rate of change of the price level, we dealt with those things changing around, is equal to the rate of change of money growth plus the rate of change of velocity. So all they've done is kind of broke it down into these little components. Well, what we observe in the data and what we probably our gut would tell us kind of makes sense is that is there any reason to believe that over time the number of times the average dollar gets spent changes? You know, does that seem to change over time? The answer to that's no. It's pretty consistent at the M2 level. So the number of times that money being measured as M2 gets changed, if we look at the data, it's pretty flat. So this ends up being 0. So this is pretty no change. So if we dump that off of the equation, we start to see how inflation comes about. We know inflation is the percentage change in the price level. And then I just want to dump this term over to the other side of the equation, and we get kind of a nice interpretation that we'll think about. Inflation ends up being the difference between money supply growth and real GDP growth. So for a moment, go back to our island and think about the amount of stuff that's going on year after year after year. If we had 1,000 units of stuff being traded that turned out to be $1,000 of real GDP, and this year we had double. We had 2,000 units being traded, right? So I'm thinking real GDP, so there's more stuff being exchanged. If money wasn't going up at the same time, if the money supply wasn't going up, would it take more dollars or less dollars for each transaction? There's only a fixed amount of money. So let's just say that money supply growth is 0. There's no change in the money supply. If the money supply was 100 today, it's 100 tomorrow, right? So we've got 1,000 units being traded versus 2,000 units being traded. We start thinking about the number of dollars that it takes. If we're not keeping up with the change in the units of stuff, then prices are going to be altered. And the inflation rate is going to match GDP. So by throwing more money into the system, if I take my dollars, I don't have my dollars out, and I inject more money into the system, that can keep up with the amount of activity. So if these two things equal each other, inflation would be 0. There wouldn't be any real price effect going on. And so the inflation rate that's attributable to money supply growth is anything that's above real GDP growth. So we can look at this equation to kind of think about the logistics there. We've got more dollars needed to trade more goods. Real GDP growth, as we're going to go over in our review session, came from more labor, more capital, more things that caused us to be able to make more stuff. Well, if we keep the dollars that are floating around the island up with the actual quantity of things we're making, then prices would remain constant. A loaf of bread that was $1.50 5 years ago would still be $1.50. Imagine that, right? So if we were able to match those two things up, there would be no movement in prices. But what we've seen over the last, since about the Great Depression, has been inflation going up, and that's because money supply growth has exceeded real GDP growth. And that's what's causing there to be persistent inflation over time. All right, questions or comments of that?
Last time you said that
Real GDP, that was kind of fixing this part of it, thinking about in the long run, real GDP is going to be whatever it's going to be. So they're going back up to this equation, not thinking about it as the rate of change. That's all that was. So this ties in more of going over time. All right, so that is Uncle Milty's equation of exchange. This stuff doesn't always pan out perfectly. Just want to share with you a little bit of something. I wish I had the overhead to put up here, but I had the opportunity back in 2008 to attend a little workshop with the author of your textbook. And in 2008, we had just kind of seen the economy go in the toilet, right? This was right in the heart of the crisis. And so he was presenting to us at a small group for lunch and said something about toxic assets that the Fed was buying. So you've heard about the bank bailout. Basically, the Federal Reserve was buying what they called toxic assets at the time. So I, after he said that, it didn't really sink in until I think I was on the plane ride back home, and I started thinking, yeah, well, what happens if the Federal Reserve buys toxic assets? Does anybody remember what the Federal Reserve normally buys and sells, open market operations? What's the asset that they buy? Bonds, government bonds. Is the United States Treasury Department almost as good as gold in paying back their bills? Yes. Haven't defaulted ever. The world thinks of us as kind of the gold standard, if you will, as a safe place to park your money. That's the type of things that the Federal Reserve would buy when they would do these open market operations. So there's your government bond, Federal Reserve, day-to-day business. I buy a bond. I'm holding on to a bond. Okay, think about that picture for open market operations. He talks about the Fed during the crisis buying toxic assets. Assets that aren't good as gold, like government bonds. Things like bad loans that banks made to other places. The Fed started changing. So I wrote him this email after the conference. I said, Michael, one thing that has stuck with me during your lunch talk was the change in the composition of the Fed's assets. I'm not that knowledgeable with the details of the Fed, but I would guess that they do not charge off bad assets very often, since they normally hold U.S. government securities. With bad assets in the Fed portfolio, is the government potentially running the printing press, quote unquote, in a discreet way? This practice will definitely lead to paying for the bailout through higher prices as well as taxes, will it not? So what I envisioned was, if the Fed's holding on to toxic assets, and you know how when people go through bankruptcy and Chase Manhattan, they just charge off the bad debt? Well, what does the government do? What does the Federal Reserve do? Normally, the Obama side of the picture pays back the Federal Reserve their money, right? They're holding this, they get money, and they just kind of keep things flowing. Now this thing is garbage. The asset that the Fed bought is garbage. What happened to the money supply now? It went up permanently. It's not this little cycle, right? So think about the process. Remember when I did the old I got to do my So the Federal Reserve, the government in theory has the opportunity to pay for weapons of mass destruction. They just go to the printing press and, okay, let's go buy some weapons of mass destruction, right? They go out and buy it. They go to the weapons company and they say, oh, this one looks like it'll kill the bad guys good. And so now you got your weapon of mass destruction to throw at them, right? So the government printed off money to buy it. Now think about what's happening with the Federal Reserve. The Fed purchased the toxic asset and threw it in the garbage. Same thing. Kind of running the printing press in a discreet way, injected money into the system, but that money's not ever coming back. All right, so here was Michael's response back to me. Russ, I enjoyed our conversations last week. I think we are heading towards the printing press. The Fed's balance sheet in the table below between September 2000 and 2008 shows the Fed's liabilities increased by 14%, definitely inflationary if sustained. Look at the drop in safe government securities and the rise in loans to banks and other sometimes toxic securities. Up from 30 billion, 30 was the amount before, so very little relative, I won't get into the whole numbers here, but 30 is relatively small of like non-government bond type stuff, to 446 billion. It went from 30 to 446 billion during the bailout time, during 2008. Now, some of those loans will pay off. Some of that money will come back, but some of it will remain permanently out in the system if they end up ultimately going bad and it goes in the garbage can. So cheers, Michael. Here's the Fed balance sheet, and then he gave me some information on that. So that insight that I had was very principles-ish. It was using this. It was just kind of thinking about how money in the system, how the Federal Reserve works, and kind of coming to that conclusion that, wow, that's like running the printing press. So I made the prediction back then that we were going to start seeing some inflation. And so far, I've been very wrong because we haven't seen the inflation for a number of different reasons. The economy's just been sluggish. We talked about currency drain. People are hoarding cash. So we're not quite seeing, but my prediction's always been as soon as the economy, the real economy, starts to ramp up, as soon as expectations change and we start to think about the future a little differently, we start to expand our businesses, buy tractors instead of Twinkies, start really planning on economic growth. As soon as the real economy starts to take off, that monetary policy, I think, should catch up with us. And you're going to start to see inflation creep up. And then the Federal Reserve at that time's got a tough decision. We're finally getting recovery in the economy. We're finally starting to get back to normal. And the Fed, in order to suck all that money back out of the system, is going to have to put in some contractionary monetary policy. They're going to have to suck that money back out, which is going to tend to damper the upward momentum. And they're not going to be very popular when they do that. But otherwise, this is what this tells us, is that it's going to happen eventually. Does the Fed have enough tools at its disposal? I don't know. We'll find out. I thought things would have happened a little quicker, but that's why economists are compared to weather forecasters. We got a little degree of freedom on our predictions. It might happen later. That snowstorm might not ever come. Okay, so questions or comments on that? All right, let's talk about the test. Like last time, I will be emailing out a practice test tomorrow morning. And you have your last homework. I did move to tonight by midnight, which is on the money market. So wrap up your homework and kind of start thinking about things that way. Those of you who are done, tonight would probably be a great time to practice some multiple choice problems by generating some of those on my Econ Lab, reviewing your old homework, that sort of thing. But I am super pleased to announce another tool in your box for preparing tomorrow, and that is a review session with our new economics tutor, Kyle Penner, tomorrow at 11. So, let's think about your study plan for a moment. First thing is complete your homework. Again, last one's due tonight. If you blew one, I will give you one freebie. You need to email me your homework number, but if you, whatever your excuse is, I don't care. You only get one of them. You can't do it again. But send me what homework number you missed, and you can make that one up. If it's asking for a password, you missed the due date. So complete your homework. I've restricted the material, remember, to chapters 6, 7, and 8. I would love to see all of you improve on this test. So regardless of your score, I want to try to provide you every opportunity to improve where you were at. So we were going to have chapter 9, but now that's off. So 6, 7, and 8. All right, number 2, we'll have a review session. Thursday, tomorrow. Thursday at 11 a.m. here in our office, in our classroom. Review session tomorrow. If you remember, when I give you guys the practice exams, I will not go over those with you or provide you the answers. However, you can go over it in the review session. So Kyle will be available, and I don't care what you guys do there. I know that last semester time was spent kind of going over that practice exam. So that would be a good opportunity for you to not miss. All right, so 3, create some multiple choice with my Econ Lab. I've mentioned before the last time, you can also maybe try the flashcard function on my Econ Lab. Good way to kind of hit definitions and whatnot. Okay, questions or comments there? And then, of course, we're going to do a review session for the rest of the time period today with me doing stuff. Oh, lecture capture. If there's some pieces that you look through your notes, remember, in general, the first day of class or second day of class, notes are number 1. Number 2 is homework. Number 3 is reading the text, which means if you have done none of this and you've skipped some classes, the first thing you should do is have every set of notes, right? So this is kind of your pecking order. Preferably you've done all 3 diligently, but that's kind of in order of importance of studying between now and Friday. Okay, questions or comments there? All right. Here's what I think you should, here's one study approach maybe for starters. And you can work on this tonight prior to the practice exam coming. So I'd really encourage you to do this. I've written it on the board at least 3 other times, I think. We were looking at chapter 5 here was the labor market. And you will be doing very well for yourself if you can go through and know with certainty what this variable is, what this variable is, what this is, what this is, what shifts this, and what shifts this. That you can do tonight prior to getting the practice exam. Mallory?
Aren't those 2 points?
Yes, they are. My brain was working faster than my... Thank you. Make sure you make that correction. Chelsea. Thank you. Another correction. We are working hard here, aren't we? All right. So, anything else that I blew during this fabulous review session? Okay. So that's kind of chapter 6 stuff. And then chapter 7, we got into loanable funds. Don't just memorize that it's loanable funds, but that's your first step. What are loanable funds? Can you define what loanable funds are? You know, put that into a definition. Take that variable, know what it means. That's tonight's kind of extra homework if you want to succeed. We're measuring little r here. What's little r? You should know that right away what little r is. The real interest rate. How do we get it? How do we derive it? Demand for loanable funds. Supply of loanable funds. That's chapter 7 in a nutshell, at least the market that we're working with in that particular chapter. There's other issues too, so this is a baby step. And then finally, chapter 8, we are measuring the quantity of money, and it's the real quantity of money. The money supply curve had a little different shape. It was vertical. Money demand. We're measuring little I over here. You guys will be so far ahead and so on your way to really being successful on the test if you can do tonight what I just said here. For each one of these pictures, what's this? Do I really know this? I haven't just memorized that it's the nominal interest rate, but what is nominal interest? How do I use that? Why is that important? The real quantity of money, money supply, money demand. What makes this shift? What makes this shift? What makes this shift? What makes this shift? That's close to probably being 70% of the exam, if you really got that stuff hammered out. So on top of that, then you'll go back and start learning some problems or challenging yourself with the practice multiple choice. But if you really hit this hard in knowing those pictures and why they're all there, you'll be well ahead of the game. Now, this little one, don't worry about. That's our mystery one, but this is going to be, if you want to complete your picture, chapter 10. So this is where we're heading down the road, is the last piece of this puzzle. So don't worry about that one, especially for this test, of course. All right. So I brought the textbook because part of me thinks sometimes you guys think you don't have to read. And I want to emphasize, I've gotten some feedback from some students that say, you know what, if I just read the stuff, I get it. It actually kind of tracks with your lectures and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of how I design things. So it's true. Chapter 6, as we flip through, so for this review session, I just want to kind of start, and I'm going to physically flip through to kind of show you guys that it's there and stuff we talked about and maybe correlate it with the notes. So the first thing in chapter 6 that we hit was the rule of 70, because we were thinking about long-term economic growth. So, know what the rule of 70 is. I'll just tell you right now that there is going to be one of your practice problems for the test that's going to kind of work through how you might use the rule of 70 in thinking about growth rates. So the rule of 70 was generic to all kinds of things. So it's kind of useful even in other disciplines. In biology, you could use the rule of 70 for how fast plant growth is going to occur dependent on changes in sunshine or something. So it's kind of a neat little thing to keep in your back pocket as you move into the future on how things work with percentage changes. All right, so the number of times it takes something to double, that's not being very good here. Let's put number of, I'll just use years, but it's whatever time frame. Number of years to double is equal to simply 70 divided by the percentage change in whatever that variable x is. So if we had 10% real economic growth, real GDP is going to double in just 7 years. So that's kind of the nice, quick way of estimating how growth rates will affect the bucket level. Because this is really talking about the number of years for the bucket to double in size. Right? This is the bucket level. This is the stock variable. And these are thinking about the flows or the rate of change of something over time. Okay, so that's rule of 70. We went through a few things there. We talked about the growth rates in some of the countries as kind of a motivating thing, which is in the front part of this chapter. And then we jumped into the labor supply, labor demand. So labor supply, labor demand stuff, which I've already covered over here. Related to that also is the production function and diminishing marginal product. The production function was that thing that looked like this. And if we're measuring labor there and real GDP here, it's just saying that as we add more and more labor, holding capital fixed, then the amount of stuff that each additional unit of labor makes falls. So it's increasing at a decreasing rate. The shape of that production function is exhibiting diminishing marginal product. Now, related to that is an increase in capital. If you give people more machines, then they are more productive. We kind of know that, right? Give me a computer compared to a typewriter and I'm more productive. I can kick out more stuff potentially. So an increase in capital leads to an increase in the marginal product of labor, and that kind of shifts up the production function. So if we were to graphically show that, 100 people used to be able to make 300 units, given only having 10 machines. But if I double the amount of machines to 20 machines, those 100 people can make more. Maybe they can make 500 units. And so an increase in capital shifts up the production function. Your textbook does a nice job of showing that relationship to the shifter. So here is the picture I just drew. And here's its connection to the demand curve for labor. The demand curve is made up of businesses who want to buy labor. And if each one of those people has more machines, they can be more productive. That would allow them to pay more for each unit of labor, and that ends up shifting the labor demand curve to the right. So from this, we then also can derive that there would be an increase in labor demand, a shift to the right. All right, so that was all kind of the productivity of labor. Technology was another shifter. We went through all the shifters before. That's why those shifters are important to know. The last part of this chapter talks about the things that'll improve long-term growth. So things for long-term or long-run growth of real GDP. And that's where we got into the accumulation of capital, which we just showed here. We can think of physical machines. We can think of education, turning it more into human capital. How do we get human capital? We add more education. We add more libraries. We increase access to the internet. I mean, there's a number of different ways that we can try to enhance our stock of labor or stock of resources in general. And then, of course, the discovery of new inventions, the discovery of new methods. All of that is some research and development issues. So we had 3 growth theories that you should know for the test. We kept that fairly short and sweet. There's more information in your textbook. But we had the classical economists that say we're all doomed because when we prosper, we make babies, and that means we're kind of not ever going to be up. We're going to have this subsistence level. Then the Industrial Revolution came with this new classical thought, and then finally the Information Revolution got people thinking about how information can lead to some nice returns, and that's our new growth theory. So we had 3 theories of economic growth, for long-term economic growth. Okay, chapter 7. So the connection for loanable funds, one of the I guess main points of this chapter is we're using loanable funds to think a little more critically about our bucket of capital. In chapter 6, we just showed how important the accumulation of capital is to long-term prosperity and economic growth. So now we're investigating, well, how does our bucket of capital change over time? And so our flow into the bucket was investment. C plus I plus G plus X, that's the I in our cigarettes. We can choose to put money into tractors rather than Twinkies. That was kind of the thought here. How do we get people on our island to be devoting more towards capital purchases and maybe less towards consumption purchases? Our bucket has a hole of depreciation, and so over the course of a year, if there's more computers bought than computers that crapped out on us, then our bucket level is going to go up, right? So we use the loanable funds market now because a lot of the capital purchases are financed. They're borrowed by companies. So when we started this off, we said, well, most of this activity is business wanting to purchase capital. And so if we think about the loanable funds going on, more of that going on means more of this going on, more investment. That's the connection in this chapter between the real thing we care about, which is capital, versus the funding of that, the loans that go on maybe, and the borrowing and saving going on in the capital market, or in the loanable funds market. We talked about the 3 different players. So you should know the 3 agents in the loanable funds market: households, businesses, and government. And we could actually add a 4th agent, but it's not really a 4th because it's all kind of one of those. There's international versions of all 3 of those. There's international consumers, international businesses, and international governments. But it's really those same 3 agents. So we talked about the domestic versus the foreign, and that gave us that equation that showed that investment is going to come from those 3 sources: private saving, government saving, or lack thereof, as we learned, and international savings, or our borrowing from the rest of the world. So those 3 agents gave us the 3 sources of borrowing, 3 sources of funds, essentially, 3 buckets that we can dip into. And because they're all acting in the same marketplace, we learned about crowding out. The government going in to borrow funds because they don't have their fiscal house in order means that they're competing with businesses who are trying to buy computers and add on to their buildings, right? So there's this crowding out effect that's important to know. We also talked about the Ricardo-Barrow effect. I'd like you to know that for the test. That kind of offsets it. Maybe some households actually save money more, which partially offsets that. Okay. Chapter 8. Chapter 8 looks at, or starts off with, what is money? How do we measure it? So we had M1 and M2, and we really didn't quit talking about M1 and M2 the whole time. So right at the start of your book, we've got the 3 functions of money: store of value, medium of exchange, that sort of stuff. Gives you some real-world information about what M2, and thinking about that. Well, M1 isn't included in M2. All those sorts of things on the measures of money. Then we got into the banking system. Talked about the Federal Reserve System and the banks. We had 12 Federal Reserve banks. We talked about the reasons why we formed it in the first place. So we talked about lots of information about the Fed. One of the things we got out of that was the fractional reserve system. What does it mean to have a fractional reserve system? We don't allow banks to loan out all of their money. They have to hold back some. And on top of that, they might have knew that, by the way, as a business owner. They might have said, you know what, it'd be kind of dumb to loan out all my money. What if Katie comes and wants her money out, right? So they were naturally doing that. That wasn't what caused banks to fail back then. But what caused them to fail is that we can't let any one bank potentially run into trouble on their own. They might not be able to ride out the rumor mill. And so each one of these holds back money at the Fed. So we have required reserves with the Fed. Therefore, if one bank is running out of money, we can use banks from other places to make up for it. We learned the 3 tools of the Fed: discount rate, required reserve ratio, and open market operations. Those are shifters over here. That's why, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, if you know those shifters, you're going to start knowing a lot more material than you think just by using that as your primary study tool. Do I really know those three graphs? All right, we learned about the multiplier, the deposit multiplier, and the currency drain. Deposit multiplier and the currency drain. And then our last thing we did today, our quantity theory of money. Any questions? Same format as last time, combination of multiple choice and short answer. We'll see you Friday.